We need to talk about what's happening to our country, what's happening to England. And I want you to listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you isn't speculation. It's not conspiracy theory. It's documented. It's happening right now, and the establishment media doesn't want you talking about it. For 700 years, the Cross of St. George has flown over this nation, through wars, through plagues, through the rise and fall of empires. That red cross on a white background has been the symbol of English identity since King Edward III made St. George our patron saint in 1350. 1350. Let that sink in. This isn't some recent invention. This isn't a logo that can be changed like a corporate rebrand. This is who we are. And now, in 2026, we're being told that this symbol, our symbol, is offensive, that it needs to come down, that it represents hatred, that it's been weaponized by the far right, and therefore decent, tolerant people shouldn't display it. Let me be absolutely clear about something. I've looked at the evidence, I've read the reports, I've watched the videos circulating online. And while the mainstream media wants to tell you one story, the reality on the ground is quite different. Yes, there are British Muslims who have embraced the flag. Ibrahim Syed at the Wirral Dean Centre, fair play to him, he put up a Union Jack when someone left one at his mosque. That's commendable. That's integration. That's what we want to see. But that's not the full picture, is it? Because at the same time, we're seeing mosques vandalized, we're told. We're seeing community tensions. We're seeing councils spending tens of thousands of pounds removing flags from lampposts. North Somerset spent 6,000 quid. Kent spent 11,000. Nottinghamshire is installing 164 flags at a cost of £75,000. That's taxpayer money, your money, my money. And here's what really gets me. The Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, stands up and says he's very encouraging of flags. He tells us the St. George's Cross represents our diverse country. He's got one in Downing Street, apparently. Lovely, fantastic. But what's he actually doing about the fact that English patriots who display this flag are being labelled as racists, as extremists, as far-right agitators? Let's talk about Operation Raise the Colours. Now, the media will tell you this is a far-right campaign. They'll point to Andrew Currian, former English Defence League, now with Britain First. They'll say, see, it's all Nazis and thugs. And yes, some unsavory characters have attached themselves to this movement. I'm not defending vandalism. I'm not defending attacks on mosques or harassment of Muslim women. That's criminal behavior and should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But here's the question nobody in the establishment wants to answer. Why did ordinary English people feel the need to start putting up their own flag in the first place? Why did this movement emerge in August 2025? What was happening in this country that made British citizens feel like they needed to reclaim their national symbol? I'll tell you what was happening. Hotels across the country were being used to house asylum seekers, not refugees fleeing war zones, not people with legitimate claims, asylum seekers, young men, predominantly, arriving on boats across the Channel. And communities that had never asked for this, never voted for this, suddenly found themselves with hundreds of foreign nationals in their local hotels, while British families struggled to find housing. The Bell Hotel in Essex became a flashpoint. Protests, clashes, community anger boiling over. And instead of listening to these communities, instead of addressing their concerns, what did the government do? What did Starmer do? He called them racists. He implied they were motivated by hatred. He suggested that anyone uncomfortable with unlimited migration into their community was somehow morally deficient. So people started putting up flags. They started saying, this is England, this is our country. We have a right to preserve our identity, our culture, our way of life. And what happened? They were called far right. They were called Islamophobic. Church of England bishops, 7 of them, issued a statement in February calling for the flag to be a symbol of unity and criticizing those seeking to sow division. Division? Let me ask you something. Who's sowing division? The people who want to fly their own flag in their own country? or the people telling them they can't because it might offend someone? The people who want border controls and sensible immigration policy, or the people calling them racist for expressing those concerns? There's a deeper issue here that nobody wants to confront. England has become the only country in the Western world where patriotism is treated as suspicious, where love of your nation is considered potentially extremist. The Scots can fly their saltire. The Welsh have their dragon. The Irish have their tricolour. Nobody questions it. Nobody calls them far right for displaying national pride. But in England? In England, if you fly the St. George's Cross outside of a football tournament, you're making a statement. You're being provocative. You're signaling something dark and dangerous. Why? Why is English identity uniquely problematic? Why is English patriotism uniquely toxic? I'll tell you why. Because there's a concerted effort, and I know saying this makes people uncomfortable, but it's true, there's a concerted effort to deconstruct English identity, to make us ashamed of our history, to make us feel guilty for being English. We're told our flag represents colonialism, that it represents the Crusades, that it represents centuries of oppression. And yes, St. George's Cross does have a history. It was carried by crusaders fighting in the Holy Land. The Knights Templar wore it. English kings invoked it when they went to war. It's a Christian symbol, explicitly Christian. That red cross represents the blood of martyrs. It represents faith. It represents a willingness to die for belief in Christ. Is that offensive? In a Christian country, and England is historically, culturally, and legally a Christian country, whether we're religious or not, is Christian symbolism now forbidden? Must we scrub away every trace of our Christian heritage in case it upsets people who've chosen to come here? Because let's be honest about what's happening. The demographic transformation of England over the past 30 years has been unprecedented in our history. In 1991, the Muslim population of the UK was under 1 million. Today, it's over 4 million. Some estimates put it higher. That's not racism, that's not Islamophobia, that's census data, that's fact. And with that demographic shift comes cultural tension. That's natural. That's inevitable. That's human nature. Different cultures, different values, different worldviews living in close proximity. Sometimes it works beautifully. Sometimes there's friction. That's reality. But we're not allowed to talk about the friction, are we? We're not allowed to point out that polling shows a quarter of British Muslims support the introduction of Sharia law. We're not allowed to discuss the fact that some Muslim communities have not integrated, that parallel societies have emerged in parts of Bradford, Birmingham, Tower Hamlets, Luton. We're not allowed to acknowledge that there are areas of England where the English flag is rarely seen, where Christmas decorations are taken down, where traditional English pubs have closed and been replaced by halal restaurants and shisha cafes. Is any of that illegal? No. Is it problematic? That depends on whether you think England should remain recognizably England, or whether you think England is just a geographical space where anyone can come and recreate their home culture without adapting to British norms. And here's where we get to the heart of the matter. The cross on the English flag isn't just decorative. It's not just a design choice. It represents something fundamental. It says, this is a Christian nation. This is European civilization. This is the culture that built parliamentary democracy, common law, habeas corpus, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, yes, including freedom of religion, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the abolition of slavery. That cross connects us to our ancestors, to the men who built the cathedrals, to the sailors who circumnavigated the globe, to the soldiers who stood against Napoleon, against Hitler, against totalitarianism. It's not a symbol of oppression. It's a symbol of freedom, hard-won freedom, defended across generations. And now we're supposed to be ashamed of it? We're supposed to take it down because some people find it offensive? Let me read you something. There's a website, a perfectly mainstream Islamic scholarly website that discusses the cross. It says, and I quote, It is not permissible for a Muslim to raise an item that carries this image, because this is a symbol of shirk, that's polytheism in Islamic theology. It goes on to say that Muslims should remove crosses from items they possess by defacing, blotting out, or covering them. Now, I'm not saying every Muslim believes this. I'm not saying every Muslim wants to remove Christian symbols from public life. Many British Muslims are perfectly comfortable living in a Christian heritage country. Many celebrate Christmas with their neighbors. Many couldn't care less about the flag one way or another. But the theology is there. The texts are there. And for those Muslims who do take their faith seriously, who do follow traditional Islamic scholarship, the cross is problematic. It's a symbol of shirk. It's a symbol of theological error. It's a reminder of historical conflict between Christianity and Islam. So when we see tensions around the street, George's flag, when we see mosques vandalized with crosses, which is criminal and should be prosecuted, when we see angry responses to the flag being displayed in Muslim neighborhoods, we need to understand there's a religious component here. It's not just about racism or immigration. It's about fundamentally incompatible worldviews. And Keir Starmer knows this. His government knows this. But rather than having an honest conversation about it, rather than acknowledging the complexity of multicultural Britain, they choose to demonize one side. They choose to make English patriots the villains. They choose to suggest that anyone concerned about these issues is motivated by hatred. Meanwhile, councils are removing flags. Police are investigating people for painting crosses on mini roundabouts. Men are being arrested for putting up the English flag. One man in Norwich was surrounded and attacked for trying to take down a flag he found offensive. His head was smashed into the pavement. Where was the outrage? Where was Starmer's condemnation? When mosques are vandalized, rightly, there's immediate response. Police investigations, council statements, politicians lining up to express solidarity, and that's appropriate. That's how it should be. But when English people are attacked for displaying English symbols, silence. When English communities are told their concerns about rapid demographic change don't matter, silence. When English culture is eroded, when English identity is mocked and belittled, silence. There's a YouGov poll from October 2025 that found both white and ethnic minority adults tend to see the flag-raising campaign as being about spreading an anti-migrant message rather than patriotism. Think about that. The English flag is now perceived by most people, including ethnic minorities, as an anti-immigrant symbol. How did we get here? How did the national flag of England become a symbol of hostility rather than unity? How did we allow this to happen? I'll tell you how. Years of politically correct conditioning, years of diversity training and unconscious bias seminars and being told that British history is something to apologize for. Years of mass immigration without integration. Years of prioritizing the feelings of newcomers over the concerns of natives. Years of treating English culture as if it's nothing special, as if it's just one culture among many, no better, no worse, and certainly not worth defending. And now we're reaping what we've sown. We have a generation of young English people who don't feel particularly English, who don't feel connected to their history, who've been taught that patriotism is dangerous, that nationalism led to the world wars, that pride in your country is one step away from fascism. Meanwhile, other communities maintain fierce pride in their heritage. Pakistani flags fly in Bradford during cricket matches. Turkish flags in North London. Polish shops in every town. African churches on every corner. And that's fine. That's wonderful. Diversity, right? Multiculturalism. But English flags in England? That's problematic. That's provocative. That's potentially racist. The hypocrisy is staggering. Absolutely staggering. Let me be clear about something else. I'm not anti-immigration. I'm not anti-Muslim. I'm not calling for deportations or bans or any of the things the left will accuse me of saying. What I'm calling for is honesty. Honesty about the challenges of mass immigration. Honesty about cultural compatibility. Honesty about whether unlimited diversity is actually a strength, or whether there are limits beyond which social cohesion breaks down. I'm calling for the right of English people to take pride in being English without being smeared as racists. The right to fly the English flag without being investigated by police. The right to say, I want England to remain English without being called far right. Is that so extreme? Is that so unreasonable? Because here's what's going to happen if we don't address this honestly. The pressure is going to build, the resentment is going to grow. People see what's happening. They see mosques being built while churches close. They see halal meat in school canteens while Christian prayer is removed from assemblies. They see women in burqas on the high street, while nativity plays are cancelled for being too religious. They see their neighborhoods transformed beyond recognition in the space of a decade. And when they raise concerns, they're told they're racist. When they vote for parties promising change, they're told they're stupid. When they protest, they're called far-right thugs. How long can that continue? How long before the majority population of this country says, enough is enough? Operation Raise the Colors, whatever you think of its origins, whatever unsavory characters have attached themselves to it, represents something real. It represents ordinary people saying, this is our country. We're not going to apologize for existing. We're not going to be made ashamed of our flag, our history, our culture. And the response from the establishment? Condemnation, dismissal. 7 bishops telling us we're using the flag to sow division. The Muslim Council of Britain saying the flag is being misused. Starmer saying nice words about patriotism while doing absolutely nothing to address why people felt the need to launch this campaign in the first place. You want to know why people don't trust politicians anymore? This is why. This is exactly why. Because they refuse to speak plainly about the most important issues facing this country. They hide behind euphemisms and platitudes while ordinary people watch their communities change beyond recognition. I've heard people say, St. George wasn't even English. He was Turkish. He never set foot in England. As if that matters. As if symbols need to be literally true to have meaning. The point of St. George isn't historical accuracy. The point is what he represents. Courage, faith, the willingness to fight against overwhelming odds, the willingness to die rather than renounce your beliefs. That resonates with the English character. That's why Edward III chose him in 1350. That's why Crusaders carried his banner. That's why Richard the Lionheart invoked his name. That's why, 700 years later, that cross still matters. And if some people find it offensive, if some people see it as a reminder of the Crusades or colonialism or Christian supremacy, then perhaps they need to ask themselves a difficult question. Are they in the right country? I know that sounds harsh. I know that's not the multicultural, inclusive, diversity-celebrating response we're supposed to give, but at some point, we need to have the courage to say it. If you've chosen to come to England, or if your parents chose to come to England, then you're choosing to live in a country with a particular history, a particular culture, a particular set of symbols. You don't get to rewrite that history. You don't get to demand that the host culture change to accommodate you. You adapt, you integrate, you become part of the story, or you choose to live somewhere else. Those are the options. But what we can't do, what we mustn't do, is allow the foundational symbols of English identity to be eroded, removed, or redefined until they mean nothing. Because if the cross of St. George becomes too controversial to display, what's next? Westminster Abbey? Canterbury Cathedral? The monarch as defender of the faith? Where does it end? Some will say I'm being alarmist. They'll say nobody's seriously talking about removing the cross from the flag. And technically, they're right. There's no official campaign, no parliamentary motion, no petition with 1 million signatures demanding the flag be changed. But that's not how cultural change works, is it? It happens incrementally. It happens through 1,000 small concessions. Through councils quietly removing flags for safety reasons. Through police investigating people for displaying them. Through schools teaching children that national pride is problematic. Through media coverage that consistently frames patriotism as adjacent to extremism. Death by 1,000 cuts. That's how cultures die. Not through conquest, not through invasion, through surrender, through exhaustion. through being told, again and again and again, that you have no right to defend what's yours. And make no mistake, there are people in this country, powerful people, influential people, who would be perfectly happy if English identity faded into obscurity, who would celebrate if the St. George's Cross went the way of the Confederate flag relegated to museums and history books, a shameful relic of a less enlightened age. These are the same people who cheer when statues come down, who support decolonizing the curriculum, who think English literature should be taught as problematic texts requiring extensive trigger warnings, who believe British history is fundamentally a story of oppression and exploitation. They won't rest until every trace of traditional English culture has been apologized for, contextualized, deconstructed, and ultimately eliminated. And Keir Starmer? He won't stop them. He'll make nice speeches about unity and patriotism while allowing the systematic dismantling of everything that makes England, England. So what do? What's the solution? First, we stop apologizing. We stop accepting the premise that English pride is inherently problematic. We stop allowing ourselves to be shamed into silence. Second, we demand honest conversations about immigration, integration, and cultural compatibility. No more platitudes about diversity being our strength. Let's examine the evidence. Let's look at polling. Let's look at crime statistics. Let's look at education outcomes. Let's look at employment rates. Let's look at attitudes toward women, toward homosexuality, toward religious freedom. Let's have the difficult conversations about whether all cultures are equally compatible with liberal democracy. Third, we support those who are willing to speak truth. Politicians, journalists, commentators who refuse to bow to political correctness, who are willing to say unpopular things, who prioritize accuracy over sensitivity. Fourth, we fly the flag, unironically, unapologetically, not as a statement of hatred toward anyone else, but as a statement of pride in who we are, the cross of Saint George belongs to all English people, regardless of color or creed. But it does represent something specific. It represents Christian heritage, European civilization, 700 years of history. If you're comfortable with that, welcome. If you're not, that's your problem, not ours. And finally, we vote. We vote for parties and politicians who will actually defend English culture, who will reduce immigration, who will deport illegal immigrants, who will prioritize integration over diversity, who will say without equivocation that England is and should remain an English country. Some of you watching will think I've gone too far. You'll think I'm being divisive, inflammatory, perhaps even bigoted. That's fine. You're entitled to your opinion. But I'd ask you to consider this. Everything I've said tonight is based on documented facts, demographics, polling data, news reports, government statistics. I haven't made anything up. I haven't exaggerated. What I have done is drawn conclusions that much of polite society refuses to draw. I've said out loud what millions of people think privately. I've articulated the concerns that get you labeled far right if you express them in public. And if that makes me controversial, so be it. Because somebody needs to say these things. Somebody needs to be willing to endure the criticism, the smears, the attempts at cancellation. Because the alternative is watching in silence as England ceases to be England, as our flag becomes too controversial to display, as our cathedrals become museums, as our history becomes a source of shame, as our culture becomes just one option in a multicultural marketplace where nothing has inherent value and everything is relative. I'm not willing to accept that future. I don't think you are either. Which is why Operation Raise the Colors, for all its flaws, for all its association with unsavory characters, resonated with so many people. Because at its core, it was about reclaiming what's ours. About saying, this is England, this is our flag, we're not asking permission to fly it. And we shouldn't have to. In our own country, in our own communities, on our own streets. We shouldn't have to justify pride in our national symbol. We shouldn't have to worry that displaying it will lead to police investigations or accusations of racism. The fact that we do worry about these things tells you everything you need to know about how far we've fallen. But it's not too late. It's never too late. As long as that red cross still flies somewhere in England, as long as someone is willing to defend it, willing to argue for it, willing to stand up and say this matters, then there's hope. St. George slew a dragon, according to legend. Perhaps it's time we found the courage to slay our own dragons. The dragon of political correctness, the dragon of demographic replacement, the dragon of cultural surrender, the dragon of progressive ideology that tells us our own heritage is shameful. Those are the dragons we face. Those are the battles we need to fight. Not with violence, not with vandalism, not with attacks on mosques or harassment of minorities, but with words, with votes, with peaceful, legal, democratic assertion of our right to remain who we are. The cross of St. George has flown for 700 years. With your help, it will fly for 700 more. Not as a symbol of hatred, but as a symbol of survival. Not to threaten others, but to remind ourselves who we are and where we came from. That's all I have for tonight. Think about what I've said, research it for yourself, and then make your own decision about what kind of England you want to live in. Thank you for watching.